and the demigods began to fall. Starting with Godwyn the Golden. Queen Marika was driven to the brink.
It was this act, the carving of the curse mark of death upon the body of Godwyn the Golden during the Night of Black Knives, that jump-started all of the events of Elden Ring and defined the lands between as we know them today. It was the Night of Black Knives that caused Marika to shatter the Elden Ring, which resulted in the Shattering Wars, whose effects and resulting suffering we can still witness in the game world. And yet, this world-defining event is shrouded in mystery. And while others have sought to retell the events of the Night of Black Knives in great detail, there is another aspect to it that has caught my interest. The death of Godwyn, or to be more exact, the death of Godwyn's soul. Now, the concept of a soul is mentioned quite a bit in the game, and it has caught my eye because it appears to be something physical or, well, almost quantifiable, naturally leading us, or at least me, to the question of what is a soul. And it is this concept of a soul, as well as how it pertains to the in-game mechanics, that I will be explaining in this video. First off though, I need to preface this video. This video will include a lot of theorizing, because despite souls being mentioned quite a bit, they are still left vague. This video will also only use information available in the game, no cut content, no external sources or anything else. This video will include spoilers for several questlines and characters. Also, within this video, we will be going over certain bigger topics, such as spirits, fate, death, and destined death. The latter two I will be explaining right now, but I won't be going into too much detail, so I'll only cover what's absolutely necessary to understand in this video. First up, death. Death is just death. It's a thing that happens to any creature that drops to 0 HP. In the current order, it is governed by the Earth Tree. Upon death, one returns to the tree and is returned by the tree. True death never really happens, as one is just looped back into the world. And while death is inflicted on the body, it reflects on the soul, as the soul itself cannot be affected directly, something we will get to in a bit. Destined death, on the other hand, true death, or the death of one's soul. The game mentions fate on multiple occasions, and without going into further detail, it is this destined death that one's fate ends in. Hence why it's destined. It is the inevitable death, basically, that each creature will suffer at some point, and it is more in line with what we in our world would consider death. And now, with all that out of the way, let's get into this. First, we'll go over the characters where the body is dead and yet the soul continues existing in some form, surprisingly quite a few of them. And since this topic was inspired by Godwyn, who better to start the video with than his fellow wearer of the half wound of the centipede and murderer by proxy, Ranni. Ranni is the one who stole the Rune of Death from Malekith. Ranni is also the orchestrator of the events of the Night of Black Knives, and as such is the sole reason for all the events in the game taking place.
The person who orchestrated the Night of the Black Knives, Lunar Princess Ranni.
It was her sinister plan to have the body half of the curse mark of death carved upon her own flesh in the exact moment of Godwyn's passing, and as a result, she had her soul bound to her current doll body. This is basically all we know about it. How her soul was bound to the doll is unknown, as well as the identity of the person who did it. Now, on a side note, it was probably one of the following. Rykard, who is known to be knowledgeable about blasphemous rites. I mean, just look at him. The Snowy Crone, who is known to be Ranni's teacher, and Ranni held enough respect for her to have her doll body carved in her image. Mind you, the identity of the Snowy Crone is still a complete mystery. And the spirit tuner Hugh mentions at one point in the game, who may also just be the Snowy Crone. But ultimately, all that we learn about souls is that even if the body dies, even from the effects of the application of destined death, the soul can be bound to another body or proxy seemingly without any adverse effects. And from what we see of Ranni, one doesn't really lose abilities or agency as a result of that kind of death. So the soul, at least in some manner, carries the user's memories and personality, however to which extent we kinda don't really know. Now, one other character who seems to exist in a manner similar to Ranni, however a bit more unbound, is none other than Shabriri, another mysterious character with a shrouded history. Now, how he got to the state that he is in now, we can't really know. Last we heard of him, his eyes were gouged out. Lovely. But he too is a soul without a body, who is capable of binding himself to proxies, and as we see in the game, he manages to take over Yura's body, even after Yura dies.
Finally tarnished. Who would be Lord? Oh my. Why the long face? I fear that you were previously acquainted with this vessel. Well, that is most unfortunate. For he is dead. As for his flesh, he gave it to me. Shabriri, I hope you can make your peace with that, and attain lordship through righteous hardship.
This naturally leads us to the question of, can a soul possess or be bound to a living body with a soul still inside? And while we can't really have an answer, at least quite yet, from the evidence given, the answer would be a resounding no. Since we don't know the other circumstances of his life and death, he only serves to basically double up on what we already know from Rani. The soul, at least, partially keeps one's memories, personality and purpose in the world, and as such seems to have a strong connection to one's fate. And this is further exemplified by the Graven Witch herself, Selen. The key part of Selen's quest that we will be focusing on here is the acquisition and transport of Selen's primal glintstone. Now we can analyze this item's description line by line. Starting with, seemingly half alive, blood vessels are visible within. This portrays her glintstone as something organic. We know that there is a connection between glintstone and fate, as well as glintstone being seemingly organic, as observed by the very existence of crystallians. The next line in the description states, in essence, a primal glintstone is a sorcerer's soul. It's the use of the phrase in essence that lets us know that while the soul is kind of contained or bound to the glintstone, the soul and glintstone are not the one and the same. So with the glintstone being organic and being tied to the soul, I believe that it's just a proxy basically. It is with this that Selen's soul is no longer bound to her body, but to this stone itself. And during this part of Selen's quest, this is Selen's body and soul, her very being, as she herself says it. And it is here that the soul is no longer tied to her old body. Now the description continues with, if transported into a compatible new body after their original body dies, the sorcerer will rise again. Here we learn two new things. The old body needs to die, and the new body needs to be compatible. Now the old body needing to die is already a pattern. Rani too couldn't just rebind her soul to her dull body. I believe it is because it's the death of the body that ultimately truly unbinds the soul from it. The body needing to be compatible, on the other hand, is a bit harder to explain as it appears rather arbitrary. However, the fact that Rani had to have her body crafted means that a compatible body may not necessarily be easy to find. The only other criteria that comes to mind is that the body doesn't already have a soul in it, as seen by Yura needing to be dead, and Selen needing the puppet version of herself, and Rani just needing a doll. So, to summarize, the soul keeps one's memories, personality and purpose, or fate or cosmic agency, depending on how you want to put it, and is strongly connected to one's fate. It can be bound to other bodies provided certain criteria are met. Now, in this short part, we'll go over the two wackiest combinations of bodies and souls and what we maybe can learn from them. Starting with the simpler one, of course, the Brothers D. The Brothers D are an interesting bunch. One only really needs to look at their armor description, which states, the two known as D are inseparable twins. They are of two bodies and two minds, but one single soul. Not once do they stand together, not one word do they speak to one another. And I do think that this description may just be a little bit more literal than you'd think at first. At no point in the game are the two in the same location, nor do they speak to each other, yet they know who the other is. From what we see, Devin, Beholder of Death, is in a catatonic state until we give him the twinned armor set. It is only after Darian's death and after receiving the twinned armor set that Devin starts acting independently. This could just be the criteria that the soul of D needs to fully take hold of the body, and I do think that the soul is moving from one to the other. As stated, Devin, before receiving the armor, is catatonic. He has no agency of his own, and it's as if his fate is halted, basically in an even worse state than Selen without hers. And we also see a lot of soft evidence that memories are shared between the two of them. If we kill Darien in Limgrave, Devin, upon receiving the armor, says, "You will know vengeance for Darien, the wrath of D." If we attack him after he kills Fia, he says, "Very well, then you are a blight, a defiler of the Golden Order and murderer of my brother. Die, die, die." Which means that he also just somehow knows that it was us who gave Darien the weathered dagger. So we can say that memories are still brought over from one twin to the other. And, as such, the already observed trend continues, with maybe a few caveats. The body needs to die so that the soul can move on to the next one. In this case, Darien needed to die so that the soul can basically repossess Devin. It draws a nice parallel between Devin, who is waiting soullessly for his soul, mere steps away from basically Godwyn, who is in a similar but worse kind of situation. And, sadly, we need to quickly mention Radagon and Marika, who seemingly, as opposed to the D-twins, appear to have two souls trapped in a single body. Now, I'm not going into the alchemical inspirations behind Radagon and Marika. Others already did that, rather extensively even. And, well, it's also knowledge completely external to the game and as such simply does not fit into how I wanted to make this video. From what we clearly know and can clearly see, Radagon and Marika are a union in body. The body changes depending on who is in control at the time. They, as people, are also completely opposed to one another and have opposing goals. That is most obvious by the fact that Marika shattered the Elden Ring, wanting to end the current order, while Radagon does whatever is in his power to fix it and reinstate his golden order. Now, many have speculated on their identities, and some saying that Radagon was always Marika, others that he was a blacksmith who rose to rank of champion. I say it doesn't really matter for this discussion, and whether Radagon has managed to become Marika also doesn't really matter here. The only thing we know for sure is that they have one body they share. That we know from the Sacred Relic Sword's item description, which states, "Sword brought from the remains of a god who should have lived a life eternal." Since the beast took Radagon's body, and not Marika's, and yet it is Marika who is actually a god, it stands to reason that the body is technically the one and the same. So the only reasonable explanation is that they are two souls in one body, while being completely different people with different goals. And even that one body swaps between Radagon and Marika. This does kind of imply that they were the same creature from the start, as by the rules said before. Radagon's soul couldn't just join in. Now, on to bodies without souls. We already spoke about Selen 2 segments ago. However, due to the fact that during her quest we remove her soul from her body, she's in a unique position where she gives us both perspectives. The soul removed from a body and the body that remained without the soul. And it is this soulless body that, in my opinion, gives us one of the most, if not the most terrifying implication in the whole game.
Thank you, my apprentice. This is my essence. Please, treat it with care. Treat it. What you hold is my very being.
This is it. Even with the soul removed, the body doesn't just die. The body still speaks, and the body is still conscious. And the worst thing about this is that it makes the tragedy of Godwyn the Golden so much worse. Now, on to Godwyn. Godwyn is, of course, interesting because he's the ultimate example of what the lack of a soul does to someone. Godwyn is stagnation. During the Night of Black Knives, Godwyn did not die, not properly at least. His body was used as a medium to ultimately apply destined death to his soul. The description of the golden epitaph sword states as much. O brother, Lord brother, please die a true death. I believe this sword is, chronologically, made after the failed ritual at Castle Sol, as it seems that by this point Mikolai has given up on saving his brother and now only wishes to finally and completely put him to rest. Both characters being tied to dreams is also interesting, especially since we get a glimpse of the so-called Godwin's dream in the game, leading us to believe that there is still at least something still left there. And there is. Looking at Selen, we see that even though the soul is no longer linked to the body, the brain, for lack of a better word, still works fine. Basically, the body still works in a biological sense, brain and synapses and breathing and all that. At least right after the removal of the soul. Only difference being that, for Godwin, death has already happened. Only in incomplete form. And it is, in my opinion at least, an interesting and horrifying question to ask. How much of him was or is still in there? How much is still conscious? Did he know what was going to happen while the Black Knives were holding him down and carving his flesh? Did he understand what was happening as they left and as his body was subsequently carried to its resting place below the minor artery? How much of his transformation into his bloated, festering abomination that he is now was he still conscious for? Just because he's completely removed from the machinations of the greater cosmos and his own fate, it doesn't mean that his body was incapable of understanding and ultimately feeling its predicament. And unlike Selen's case, he was hit with destined death, like the ultimate and true end. There is nothing, no proxy or primal glintstone to which his soul is still tethered. It has been inflicted on his soul, and his soul is well and truly gone. That's why it can't return, not through the artery and not through the eclipse ritual in Castle Sol. Ultimately, through all of this, we learn what the absence of a soul does, further defining it. The lack of a soul is the lack of cosmic purpose, in a sense, as the soul serves as an anchor to which one's fate is tied. In the absence of one, the person, or what remains at least, stagnates as one is completely disconnected from one's fate, and as such, one's future. And now, with all this said, let's define a soul as well as a circle of life in the lands between. The soul itself is one's essence, as well as an anchor point that binds one's body and one's fate. It also contains the thoughts, memories, and personality of its owner, I guess. The body is the medium through which the soul and the world affect each other. This, of course, includes death, as to kill someone's soul, one needs to inflict that death through the medium of the body, as seen in both general in-game violence as well as Godwin. By extension, if there is no soul, then there is nothing driving the body and the body stagnates, because there simply is nothing else for the body to do once its fate has been removed, and in Godwin's case, can't even really die. Every soul has a fate to which it's tied, and every fate, like every life, ends with death. That death, the final death, is the so-called destined death. Destined death is not something one can recover from. And, with the rune of death sealed away, it is the earth tree that now governs life and afterlife as, instead of moving on towards destined death, souls are recycled and made alive anew, breaking the established, pre-Golden Order cycle of life and death. And now, let's patch up the rest. So far, everything up to now makes sense with the evidence we have gathered. Now all we have to do is see how this theory holds up in all the edge cases that concern souls. This will include spirit ashes, wraiths, those who live in death, and ancestral spirits. Let's start with spirit ashes and the spirit calling bell, whose item description states: a bell capable of summoning various spirits from ashen remains. So, what's a spirit ash? Every description starts with ashen remains in which spirits yet dwell, so, at the very least, we know that they are burnt remains of someone who died. The question of when they died is interesting though. What immediately makes sense is that they died any time after the sealing of the Rune of Death, so even before the Night of Black Knives. Just looking at the available ashes in the game, it seems to check out, as most of the named ones are from the Shattering Wars. And while some of them belong to species that are a lot older than the sealing of the Rune of Death, such as the, for example, Oracle Envoys, all of them could have died and been cremated or burned after the rune sealing. Since the time frames in the games are rather vague, even those like Death or the Stormhawk King could have easily existed during those times, especially knowing that Stormvale was only conquered by Godfrey. Spirit Ashes are far more than just animated corpses as seen by the Fanged Imp Ashes, which state, "These spirits are well suited to causing a disturbance, moving nimbly like pests and hurling magic pots." The two imps seem fond of each other's company. It is the fondness of each other's company that implies that they are more than just a mechanical or soulless apparition. The spirit jellyfish is in a similar boat. A floating spirit that illuminates its surroundings. Prone to tears, the jellyfish girl seeks for her distant home, will bravely spew poison at foes on her summoner's behalf. It seems her name is Aurelia. She even has a special interaction with her sister, or deceased sister.
I've been waiting for so long. Forever and ever it seems. Dear sister, you're finally here. No time to waste. Let's see the stars.
However, spirit jellyfish are a bit confusing in the first place. Are they spirits to begin with, or are they just connected to spirits in some way? Since they leave behind ashes, I think they are a fully fledged species that is merely connected to souls or spirits in certain ways, likely using or taking up souls as part of their life cycle. They as a species act similarly to the ashes themselves, basically as a vessel for a soul. And that would also be in line with the beliefs of the ancestral followers, as read from their armor description. The ancestral followers live a distance from the Earth Tree, awaiting new buds. They are certain to sprout from the very flesh and indeed their souls. And we even find spirit jellyfish close to the ancestral followers' woods. Also in our world, jellyfish are one of the earliest life forms, and as such would fit rather well together with the ancestral followers as something that came along long before the Golden Order. So Aurelia is basically what remains of one of those creatures, implying that at least part of one's soul still remains in one's spirit ashes. And when it comes to ashes, last but not least we have Latenna. Latenna easily ignores the general rules of spirit ashes because, I don't know, obviously we have not suffered enough at the hands of the Albunaric archers. Her spirit ash description states, Latenna was renowned as a deft magic archer, but having lost her beloved wolf companion Lobu, she cannot move from the place where she was summoned. Latenna has a summonable spirit ash in line with all the others, mechanically. However, lore-wise, she isn't even dead, and she speaks to the player even when not summoned. And we leave it at that. She is a summonable spirit while not really following the rules that seem to exist for all other spirit ashes. And the description still calls her ashes ashes. The only explanation being that she basically dies when we speak to her in Liurnia and her body just falls into dust instantly. So to clarify, as the name states, spirit ashes are a combination of spirit and ash. The ash, the creature's original body, is used to give it form. However, it is at least partially animated by the spirit or soul of that original creature. And as a quick mention, while on the topic of spirit ashes, the headless knights around mausoleums are basically spirit ashes, and the bell in the mausoleum is just a bigger spirit calling bell to which they answer. Wraiths too can be lumped in with spirits, they are a similar species. To make a long story short, wraiths are the vengeful spirits of those who died when cursed, referring of course to the seedbed curse. The main distinction between them and spirits being that the true death of these souls is specifically halted by the seedbed curse, making them unable to reach either the Earth Tree or destined death. Now, when it comes to those who live in death, they're a bit complicated. First, it's implied that they are a product of Godwin's death blight and as such lead truly soulless existence, and that might be true, but I believe for only one kind of the undead. Now, according to the wiki, as well as which enemies receive extra damage from the spell Litany of Proper Death, the undead, or those who live in death, include skeletons, spirit collar snails, skeletal snails, death and deathrite birds, and while not receiving extra damage from the spell, I feel like they belong anyway, Tibia mariners. First up, skeletons are obviously a result of Godwin's deathblight spreading through the lands between and animating the corpses of the dead. Easy. Death and deathrite birds make things difficult, as they appear to be from an age before the Earth Tree and possibly the Crucible, so long before deathblight became a thing entirely. However, that also means that they come from an age when the Elden Ring had a completely different composition than that of today. And back in their age, they were the ones responsible for the managing of departed souls. That's why they are adapted using Ghost Flame, as it ties further into their manipulation of souls. So for them, it's not a connection to Godwin that makes them undead, but their position as intermediaries between the dead and the living that puts them into the undead category. And they, as well as Godwin, simply fall outside of the current Golden Order. Skeletal and spirit collar snails make things even sillier. Since they are obviously skeletal and take extra damage, they are undead. But otherwise they don't seem connected to Godwin in any special way. Because why would there be a skeletal snail and not a skeletal goat or skeletal bunny thing? So there must be something that differentiates them from the other animals. Also, spirit collar snails call upon spirits just like we, the players, do. And since spirit summoning is tied to the current age, this would tie them to the current age too. And I think that to properly explain them, we need to look not towards the undead, but towards other snails. And just looking at them, we have serpent snails, crystal snails, skeletal snails, and spirit collar snails. So this appears to just be a species that absorbs from their environment and then adapts to it in a similar manner to crabs with Godwin's face on them, or especially Miranda flowers that take up properties of their surrounding areas. So, just like that, the skeletal snails adapt to deathblight affected areas. And the spirit collar snails have somehow taken up both the properties of spirits as well as the ability to summon them. So, while not originally soulless undead, they seem to have just adopted to either spirit affected areas or Godwin's deathblight, or Godwin's state of undeath, and just taken over those properties. Now, Tibia mariners, reminiscent of the Greek ferryman of the dead Charon, seem to lead and summon dead. Now of course, there is the whole metaphor about Godwin representing stagnation and having an aquatic form equated with the stagnant waters which Tibia mariners dwell, sure. However, what exactly they are and why they are different from the other undead is unclear. They likely fulfill a role similar to that of the deathrite birds, or they used to, before Death and Death was sealed away. By the time we find them in-game, they can do hardly more than gather the undead, and, like Godwin, await Death's return in pools of stagnant water. And lastly we have the Ancestor Spirits. It's called a spirit, without sharing any properties with other spirits or spirit ashes, so it's its own unique creature type, once again similar to the spirit jellyfish. It's obviously older than the current makeup of the Elden Ring, so the rules of the current order do not necessarily apply to it. We also already mentioned the ancestral followers and the spirit jellyfish, who are both tied to ancestral spirits. In addition, we have the ancestral infant's head item, whose description states: skull of a very young ancestral spirit. Just think of how many sproutings it might bear. Used to spray spirit vapor inflicting magic damage. The vapor becomes a temporary geyser which deals continuous damage to everything it touches until it disappears, basically guaranteeing that the ancestor spirits are an actual species that goes through a normal life stages. As a young is mentioned, and whatever we fight is not called young, and the difference in the size of the head is very obvious. So, combining everything we learned up until now, we can safely assume that the ancestral spirits are a species following a similar cycle of life to that of the spirit jellyfish, where they basically recycle the souls of the dead and serve as kind of a reincarnation for the ancestral followers. Basically, not even remotely following the cycle of life that a soul has to undergo as defined by the Golden Order. And with that, that's it. That's all there is to know about what souls are, how death works, what happens after death, and how soul-related things work outside of the realm of death and the current Golden Order. And I hope you got this far. Thanks for watching, I hope to see you around, and bye.